Have some themes that have come up in your questions across groups, but we also might take just a couple minutes to do some reporting back of general questions or things that came up and how we would collect these data. One question came up about, so like first year versus additional years. And so it may be that in your first year you have a higher cost because there's more startup that goes in. So then in that case you would have your cost for year one, you'd have your cost for year two, and you could talk about that, about the differences across years. And in the IES Goal 3 in previous years and their requests for applications, it has said that it's good to break out those costs across years so that you can look at that. Okay, so another one, like teacher time. So we'll talk about this a little bit with Rob, but generally, like we use a wage for a teacher, so we'll use an annual teacher salary wage. We'll divide that by 180 days in a year, and then it's a decision of 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day to get the hourly rate, and then we apply that rate to teacher time. So we apply that rate to teacher time in prep that's done outside of school or time during school. Whenever it is that we're valuing teacher time, we use that hourly rate. Now that hourly rate may not necessarily reflect the true total number of hours a teacher works, but that true total number of hours that teachers work, if we were to use that with the pay, then the pay per hour would be much lower, and that wouldn't represent the value of that time, right? But you can talk about that more with Rob. Okay. All right, so what about adding those volunteers? Doesn't that make our cost estimate look really high? Doesn't that make us look really bad? How are we going to possibly sell this to a program? So that's where making sure that you're really clear about that distribution of costs. Who's paying for them? So you do want to get that total dollar amount to represent all of the resources that you're providing to students, which may include volunteer time or donated resources. But then you want to be really clear about how those resources are financed so that it's clear to a school, oh, I'm going to get $36.10 in resources, but I only have to really fork out $300 and something out of my budget per child and $300 and something in resources that we already have. Okay. Thinking about what's built into prices, right? So when we think about different taxes, different commuting, different assumptions about who's signing up for what, when they receive a position or when they volunteer for something. Those again are great great questions for Rob. But generally from the cost perspective, we want to make sure that we're valuing a resource in a way that appropriately reflects the qualifications and the time and the responsibilities of that individual or that material, whatever the resource is. We want to make sure that that dollar value adequately represents that resource. All right, so then we had some questions about surveys and interviews and different types of data collection, and are there trade-offs? Interviews are time-consuming, so interviews are expensive on your research budget. However, interviews can be a really great way to dig in. So I heard a conversation going on over here, Rob giving an example about a principal saying, we really don't like to put numbers on things. That can be, you have to sort of have some sense of how your participants are going to respond to different questions. Because if you have someone who doesn't want to put a number on something and the only time that you're getting that information from them is on a survey, then you're largely going to have a lot of unusable data from your survey. But if you're in an interview where you can say, oh, I know, I understand that this is hard, we're not judging you, we're not saying whether or not you're doing this right or wrong, we want to be able to say this is what went into doing this. This is what went into making this work. If you were to go and tell another principal, hey, principal to principal, here's what I had to do to make this work, what kind of things would we talk about? How often did you meet with your teachers about this? Was this like a quick in the hallway kind of thing? So we're talking like maybe 5 minutes, 2 minutes. Are we talking about once a day? Or are we talking about once every 8 months? Like, in a conversation, you can make that a relatable conversation that feels less threatening and one where you know that you're getting the data that you need. However, we've already talked about burden and we've already talked about the cost of research. So we know that we want to limit those questions to only the ones that we really have to do in person. Anything else that you can get from a survey or anything else that you can get from existing data or from an observation where one of your researchers is then already saying, you know, they're doing guiding reading for 30 minutes, they're doing this phonics program for 15 minutes. While they're in the room, they can already note the number of computers. They can already note what kinds of books are in the classroom, how many students there are, right? There are a lot of things that your data collectors can go ahead and collect while they're in the schools without adding to that with additional activities. Okay, so what about student time? Oh, yeah.
Suggested that the people that don't want to put a number on it, like how many minutes, it was a great suggestion. Ask them what percentage of their time that they spend on it, because I could see the people that I work with, I could say, like if somebody's doing a professional developing a seminar, you say, okay, what did you spend maybe 10% of your time doing this, or 20% of your time over the past? But it kind of takes the pressure off instead of when you try to nail them down. I thought it was a fabulous suggestion in saying, well, it took me 13 hours. They might, I mean, you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
I thought that was excellent. I
Yeah.
just wanted to share that.
No, that's super helpful. That's definitely one with the talent search program where there's administrators, so there are these fixed costs. There are these administrators who sort of oversee multiple programs and multiple components of multiple programs. And for that individual, rather than saying, how many hours did you spend on talent search, I would say, how many different programs are you running? And so would you say about 1/3 of your time is going to talent search? And that was really helpful.
Yeah,
I do try to be careful with that, though, too, because then you might get more than 100%. If you ask someone to break out...
Well, yeah, if you ask me, you'd get 180% of...
Absolutely.
But if I just ask them about one program, you know, I mean, but I think, you know, it's just kind of, well, I spent 20% of my time doing thus and so.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can have a sense, too, of... you'll know in your data collection activities where you have less precision. And in those areas, that's where you would go in and do some sensitivity testing. So you might say, geez, across the board, our principals had a really hard time answering this question. We had to get these rough percentages. So let's make sure that we vary that to see how much our cost per student in the end really might depend on how we worked that interview out. Okay, student time. If it's a college student, that time could be really important. That time could be time that was spent working. All other, or like you know, any kind of adult, I think that time can be really important and valued. For students in secondary and elementary school, I don't usually count that time. But that can be a decision, right? That can be based on your context, based on what you know about that population. If this is a summer school program and you know that the high school students who are attending your summer school program are giving up wages to be there, maybe that's something that you consider. Okay, and then what is incremental? All right, so when we talk about net costs, or when I talk about treatment minus control, or when I talk about treatment being compared to nothing, it's this idea of above and beyond what is being received by your comparison or your control group. So those, like saying net cost or incremental, is kind of the same thing. The difference is that sometimes when we know that the treatment is being compared to nothing else, we can estimate an incremental cost without ever subtracting anything out. But then in other cases, we might need to also look at that control group and see, should we net out any costs? And then we end up with this net cost estimate, which is our way of getting to an incremental cost estimate. Is that helpful? Okay.
Do you think about that the same way as a counterfactual? Do you consider those two the same thing?
Say that in another way for me.
So are you trying to get a sense of what would have happened to this group, or, well, I guess in terms of benefits, and or thinking about in terms of costs? What would the cost be if
Yes.
this program was not
Yes.
implemented?
Yes. So that's why in everything yesterday, I continued to push. You want to look at cost of the treatment and of the control, because you want something that's approximating a causal difference
Yeah.
in what you're estimating for your costs, right? So you want to be able to say, in the absence of this program, here is what would have happened.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's your counterfactual, business as usual, control condition, whatever label you want to put on that, that's what that needs to be. And so then what we want is for you to have a cost estimate that matches an effectiveness estimate so that it's incremental, it's above and beyond. Okay, so if you guys want to sit, you can totally sit. We don't have to remain standing.
I just have a question, just with the, go back to last time, when you were talking about teacher time and student time. Do you have to be consistent with, whether you decide to be local or national? Because you were talking with the student time, you can kind of use a local estimate because you know the population. Then for the teacher time, do you also need to?
This is a great question. It's a great question, and it definitely helps us to move into the next session as well. So come and sit. Come and sit. Everybody, let's move back to our seats, and we'll talk. I'll keep talking while you guys are moving. So for that, yesterday we talked about being consistent. So part of being consistent, Coffee is coming. Yes, coffee is coming. Coffee is coming. I just wanted to answer her question. But part of being consistent, right, that's using the same kind of pricing. So either we pick like a local standardized price. So I'm doing some work in Boston. For that work, we picked like an average Boston price so that everything was in Boston prices. Or you might use a national price so that everything's in national prices. But generally, you want everything to be in the same standardized price so that it's all comparable. And so Rob will talk to you a little bit more about that coming up next.